Hi, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11B live lesson. The last lesson that we left off, the one we'll be covering today, is beat poetry. So we've been doing a lot of postmodernism, modernism, how literature in English looked after World War I, World War II, and now we're kind of in that space between World War II and Vietnam. So we're just gonna get into it. It's a little longer than I would assume it would be, actually. So we're going to just take our time and try to go through this as quickly as possible. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so we're going to start off on slide number 5. So of course, in these lessons, a lot of what people write is dictated by history and what's happening in the world at that point in time. So it starts off with some background. Postmodernism began as a reaction movement to World War II. We know that from the previous lesson on postmodernism and the rise of postmodernism and elements of postmodernism. And one of the things that was talked about in the previous lesson was the effect that media specifically and all of the increase in economic activity to the US, how that affected the US as a country and the unease that people felt about it. So there was also developments in technology with TV and radio and just in general, things that influence the rise of mass media. Excuse me. And this is what this slide talks about here. It says here, rapid advances in technology brought previously inaccessible information directly to American living rooms. Television broadcasts changed the way Americans viewed their nation and current events. And you also have to remember that the Vietnam War was a big part of this, and they give you details about this at the bottom. So there are two factors that affected things. There's the intense coverage of the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. And then there's also the Vietnam War. There was a big difference between what the government was supplying to people in terms of information and what the media was covering. There were a lot of movies that came out reflecting that time and reflecting that the media was kind of in a fight between what the government wanted to present and what was actually happening. The Vietnam War was broadcast on television. And it was featured daily in newspapers. So a lot of people got to see what was actually happening in the trenches. It wasn't the same as during World War I, where people would leave and they just wouldn't come home. That impacted people in a negative sort of way. But being able to see the actual action as it was unfolding or relatively close to how it was unfolding during the actual battles influenced how Americans felt about the war and whether or not they believed in the war or supported the war. And because the media was showing them different things than what the government was reporting, the US public was having some issues with trusting the government to tell them about what was really going on. This is during the time where there was a lot of like Big Brother sensationalism. And a lot of it began with stuff like this, with saying, well, if the government's not telling us what's going on, then had they ever been telling us the full truth of what's been going on? So media being at odds with the government and political movements kind of got its, not that it started here, but that it became a popular viewpoint and expression of people here during this time. And here it says, such in-depth media footage was rare in previous US wars. The military typically provided war footage to the public, and most Americans didn't question government actions between World War II and the Vietnam War. But as the Vietnam War dragged on and casualties mounted, Americans began to wonder if the war was justified. So obviously, it's taught also, if you've seen like in your government courses or social studies courses, it will be mentioned that part of the influence of pulling out of the Vietnam War and not continuing is that there was so much disapproval from American citizens about it. A lot of Americans were just not sure what the aim of America was at the time. You know, are we doing this for resources? Are we doing this for to help people? Are we doing this to settle actual issues? And people started to weigh the actual pros and cons of being involved in war once they got to see in the trenches of things happening and not just footage afterwards. So this spawned kind of a counterculture. This is that sort of like peace and love hippie counterculture that's kind of a stereotype these days. People who became pacifists because they didn't think war solved anything. People were worried about this during World War II a little bit with the nuclear bombs going off, but considering that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor first, mostly World War II is considered, and our involvement in it is considered justified. But with this specific war, with citizens being deployed over there to settle a dispute that wasn't necessarily ours to begin with, there was just a lot of people questioning why we were continuing to be involved when people obviously didn't want us there. And it seemed like we were just inflicting a lot of horrific things on other people. Before, Americans, like I said, they trusted the government, they trusted what they were told. And what we know now is that it's important to have different impartial factions that report on this stuff, because people will change information to suit their goals. And it's important to have lots of different sources of information, just like when you're writing a paper or doing, research for an essay, so that you can get the full picture of what's happening. And that's pretty much what happened with media rising up with technology during this time. It became basically an example of people getting to see multiple sides of things and just not liking what they were seeing. And this is part of the Beat generation in the 1950s. So basically the Beat generation was that tiny phase before the hippie movement got started in the 1960s. So people who opposed the Vietnam War, opposed war and America's involvement in stuff. It started with the Beat generation, which we're covering today in terms of Beat poetry, and then that developed into the social hippie movement later. Okay, so on slide 9, they give you kind of the rundown on the Beat generation and the group that they drew influence from. So they drew a lot of influence from the Transcendentalists. And I'm not sure if you remember this from previous, lessons in the class, but the Transcendentalists were basically a group of people who very specifically believed in the ability of people to live on their own, self-sustainable, and to not just do things because social rules call for it or the government calls for it. They also believed in civil disobedience. So they felt like if you thought a law or a policy was stupid, you should be able to not follow it in protest. So the Beat generation drew inspiration from this. If you were with us in previous years, or you took 11A earlier this year, you'll recognize the Transcendentalists because there's a lesson on them. So the important things about this movement are the civil disobedience. They believed in getting closer to God through nature and through your own connection to nature, not just through participating in religion. And they believed in the importance of appreciating nature and not just giving into the lifestyle that cities push on people. Now, the important part, obviously, for the Beat generation was the civil disobedience, refusing to follow laws and rules that you think are dumb and making logical arguments for why you don't want to follow them at the same time. They kind of took this in heart and it became part of the Beat generation. Now they give you a list of names here of the people who were involved with the founding of this generation. We have Jack Kerouac, I'm sorry. We have Lucien Carr and Allen Ginsberg. And there are a couple others they're gonna introduce a little later. We have William Burroughs here. And I think that there's one more that we get a reading from. We get Bob Kaufman and Who is the last one? Let me see. The last one is Lawrence Ferlinghetti. There you go. So, but it did start with just these three. Jack Kerouac, Lucien Carr, and Allen Ginsberg. They met while attending college in New York, and then they met William Burroughs. So they explain here that originally they were called the Greenwich Beats. And originally they were just sort of a group of people who met that had the same ideals. They were basically just talking about, almost like a club, just talking about what they believed in and what they felt like they shouldn't have to do and that kind of stuff. And they ended up not being a great role model for people at the time, which made opinions on what they did mixed. There was a lot of drug use and alcohol abuse in terms of like their meetings and discussions and stuff. So at first people just didn't know like what was the point of these guys getting together. It's not really until they started putting out literature and getting published that they were recognized. They give you some background on the term beat from the in the second paragraph here. It says Kerouac originated the term beat. He claimed a number of meanings and origins, including beaten down, beatific, and upbeat. So basically, the idea is supposed to encompass basically the development of the beat movement over time. The first and sometimes violent phase defined the beaten down aspect. The Beats attempted personal, societal, and cultural understanding within a turmoil of a post-nuclear and post-Holocaust society. So basically, it started off with them just having a rough time trying to settle how they felt amongst themselves about things that were going on at the time. And that ended up becoming art with the things that they wrote and published and put out there. And then it got picked up by other people. So they give you some information about the rough period of things by giving you some of Ginsberg's backstory. So the long story short of it is that he was convicted of harboring stolen goods for a friend, and he pled insanity to avoid being convicted. And when he pled insanity, he was institutionalized for a while. And after he was released, he tried to work like a normal 9-to-5 white collar sort of life. But he kind of just wasn't satisfied with that. He kept in touch with Jack Kerouac. And at the time, while he was institutionalized, Jack was starting to write On the Road, which was based on travels that these groups, that this beat group took going across the United States. So it was supposed to be, this is where they start actually writing about their experiences and putting commentary about what they think is happening to the US into their writing. Let's see. He basically, after he like tried to live like a sort of straight-laced life, he was very unhappy with it, and he ended up writing because of it to get his feelings out. So these works between like Kerouac and Ginsberg is what got them into the second phase of the beat generation, which is the beatific. And they give you a little more information about Ginsberg here. He was featured as a poet at Six Gallery, a small art gallery in San Francisco. And this event brought together Ginsberg and 4 other local poets, all unknown. So this is where we get more people who are adding to the beat movement. So they're meeting each other, talking about how they feel and sort of getting into what they believe or don't believe. And because they're able to identify with each other, they all kind of become part of the group. So there's Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He was the owner and publisher of City Light Books. And he ended up publishing some of Ginsberg's stuff. And let's see, it says the publication of one poem by Ginsberg put City Light's book on the map. It also started one of the most notable trials in US history. Basically, he ended up he and his company were sued for printing poetry that was deemed offensive by the day's standards. And then it says, in a landmark decision, Judge Clayton W. Horn ruled that the poetry had redeeming social importance and therefore could not be considered offensive. So this was one of the more important rulings that basically established that just because there's offensive material in a book, story, or poem doesn't mean that it can't be published in this country. And because it was such a trial is such a big sort of thing, the beat movement became more popular and more well known because the trial made it so that people were more aware of that type of writing and the ruling as well. It says the poem was the first in a literary movement known for its social outcry and influence, and it introduced the beats to the American public. I'm sure you guys were wondering, you know, at the beginning, like, okay, so we got like these 3 or 4 guys that are like meeting together in someone's basement. How did they become popular? And this is how. Just the history. It was them sort of just struggling in a world that was developing in a direction that they didn't like. And they did write some stuff to sort of protest it. But, you know, if no one picks it up, then no one's going to know what it is. But it's not until Ginsberg was published by Ferlinghetti and they got sued about it that people understood the beat movement, started joining it, and sort of like gave it form. It started to actually have like characteristics. You could say, well, this is what a beat poem is. Alrighty. So now we're going to go into that sort of list of what it is that beat poetry is. Now, as you can see here on this slide, it says literature of nonconformity, beat poetry. So they're already giving you a hint here of what it is. Nonconformity means to not conform or to not shape yourself in the way that society, you know, wants you to, right? So we've got just information here about how they took modernist values and basically took it to another level. So they give you a quote here. Ezra Pound, that we covered in one of our previous lessons, she was a modernist poet, or he was a modernist poet. He said, make it new. And they took this idea and sort of ran to it. They ran with it. They wanted their literature and poetry to have social impact. They wanted people to hear it and hear something new and to be more interested in understanding what the meaning of it is. It says here that their works included frank descriptions and discussions of taboo social subjects, profanity not seen previously in serious literature, and extreme experiments with form. So remember, experimenting with form is something that happened during the modernist movement. There was, if you go a couple lessons back to one of my previous videos, we talked about how there was an author who wrote a book that was delivered in a box, and it was just a bunch of sheets stacked on top of each other. And outside of the first page and the last page, people were encouraged to read the middle pages in whatever order they want. All of these things had to do with people just sort of wanting to do something different and step away from the sort of rhyming, iambic pentameter, Shakespearean sounding stuff that we've been learning about up until now. Now, the profanity, cursing and stuff, that was not previously in poetry. People would describe cursing or actually spell out like, well, I curse your family to these consequences. But no one actually put swear words in actual literature or poetry, not in a broad practice. I'm sure that there were people here and there that did it, but this was the first time that poetry and literature that was meant for mass consumption, that was serious, had these sort of things in it. And then it says Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, 2 forerunners of the beat movement, we just had their names earlier, were best known for their controversial subject matter and approaches. So remember, it's not just that they were doing this to put emphasis on things. They wanted to draw people's attention. They wanted to actually have people look at their poetry and look at their nation, the country, the US, and think, do I also feel like this? Do I also have a problem with what's going on here? Okay, so here we learn about the influences on beat poetry. So it wasn't just experimenting with form, the way that poems are structured, or experimenting with subject matter. It was the way that they incorporated things from other types of movements that help make up beat poetry. So not only did they try to make it new the same way that modernists did, they also were influenced by jazz music, which was coming up at the time. Now, it's important to remember when we are studying history, especially literature, not everything happens, like in a bubble. It's not just like a linear thing where, oh, this one thing happened and then this other thing happened. In different locations, in different places and times, there are lots of things happening. Excuse me. There are lots of things happening at the same time. So the Harlem Renaissance was happening or had happened, but jazz was popular now. It had influenced the music scene and the poetry scene. So a lot of the elements of jazz music overlapped with things that were used in beat poetry. And you also have to remember that jazz music itself and the incorporation of jazz syncopation, all of these sort of things, musical qualities into poetry, modern musical qualities in poetry, influenced art, it influenced poetry and how people wrote things and expected to read things. And it itself was a counterculture. It was also a way of saying, well, we don't want to do that stuffy classical stuff. We can make these works of writing come alive. So jazz music and the counterculture that came from it, the hipster culture, was very popular at the time. It fit in very well to the stuff that the beat poets were trying to display in their writing. So I give you some background on this. They talk about how the term hipster comes from the 1950s slang hip or hep, which means in the know. So a lot of people know that. That's like considered, like pretty old people slang. Like, I'm hip, I know what's going on. That's where the term hipster comes from. That used to be very popular. Basically, I want to say like 6 or 7 years ago, you were called a hipster if you were kind of like, I've discovered this first before it became popular, that kind of thing. And it was used kind of ironically to make fun of the original movement, which was basically exactly that, being excited about being hip or in the know and understanding new things that were happening. So in the beginning, though, hipster described jazz musicians and their fans because not everybody liked jazz. And jazz fans and musicians kind of like assumed, it says here, aloofness about towards the hustle of normal life. So by aloofness, they mean pretending that whatever is going on doesn't concern them. Like, I'm into everything that's happening with jazz right now. I don't live my life like a conventional person. So everything that normal people do, I don't know what that is. You can keep that over there. That's like the idea of what aloofness is. And you can see the connection between hipsters during this time and hipsters, how we've been using it in modern times. Hipsters opposed what they viewed as the puritanical nature of American society. So they pretended to basically have nothing to do with how people were expecting them to live so that they could emphasize the things that they cared about and that they enjoyed, which was jazz and perhaps some things that were considered like inappropriate for people at the time. And then here at the bottom, it basically just says bebop, a style of jazz that features a fast tempo and improvisation, particularly reflected the hipster attitude and influenced the style of many beat poets. So they're telling you that the fast tempo and improv is a big part of the work that beat poets do. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're on slide 15. We're still continuing features of the beat poetry and the beat movement. So we talked about experimentation here before in a couple slides back, but we're going into it a little more detail here. It says William S. Burroughs, he was one of the names mentioned earlier, is one of the best known beats who experimented with form, particularly the cut-up technique he invented. And then they give you the definition of that. As part of his distrust and dislike of established institutions, so it means like government organizations, things that are meant to rule and organize, Burroughs attempted to create new meaning from existing words, stating that cutting up existing words and rearranging them, you are breaking down the control system. So he basically took the Shakespearean approach to things and decided that it's important to switch around your words and the meanings of words. It's important to constantly change the language that people who are fighting the powers that be are using. Don't make it easy for people at the top to understand what's going on at the bottom, because they don't have your best interest at heart and they're just going to ruin what you're doing anyway. And then they give you a quote from Burroughs where he explains how he personally feels about cutting things up. It says, all writing is in fact cut-ups, a collage of words read, heard, overhead. What else? Use of scissors renders the process explicit and subject to extension and variation. So extension is like to stretch something out to add to something, and variation is to change things up. So explicit means to say directly. It says the use of scissors renders the process explicit. So it's very direct. You can tell that things are being cut up. And subject to extension, adding to it, and variation, changing it. Clear classical prose, so that's like classical ways of writing, can be composed entirely of rearranged cut-ups. Cutting and rearranging a page of written words introduces a new dimension into writing, enabling the writer to turn images and cineramic variation. So he's basically saying that you can make something that sounds classical even from cut up words, and that you can rearrange written words to add new meaning and like layers of understanding to the writing. And it says enabling the writer to turn images in cineramic variation. So he's talking about making your the pictures that you're putting together, the imagery, move in the same way that you can change scenes in a story. So when it says images shift sense under the scissors, smell images to sound, sight to sound, sound to kinesthetic. So this is like an example of him using the cut up approach. This sentence here, I'm going to read it again. Images shift sense under the scissors, smell images to sound, sight to sound, sound to kinesthetic, right? So just to break this down, images, we know those are pictures, and it says shift sense under the scissors. So remember, the scissors is cutting up the words to try to figure out how you can move things around, changing up the image in your head. So shift sense. So it's saying that by cutting up words and putting them in different places, in splicing different words together, like shoving them together to get new concepts, you're changing how people see the words in their head or hear the words when they're listening. And then it says smell images to sound, sight. So here he's talking about changing up the different ways that you can make something clear. You normally can't smell an image, but if you cut up a description the right way, you can make it so that someone can think of the smell that they would smell while they're looking at a photo. If you look at a photo of an old style bakery, and you can see that someone is rolling out dough, if you know what that smells like, seeing the images means that you can imagine how it would smell, right? And it's the same thing with sound, sight. If you are looking at a picture of a parade, you can imagine how loud the crowd is in your ears with everyone being pressed in so close together. So the way that you put those words and pictures together in your writing can affect how people read them and perceive them. So then we've got sound to kinesthetic. So kinetics, which is the base word here for kinesthetic, means movement, physical movement. So kinesiology is the study of like how the body moves, right? So we're talking about translating sound, sight to sound, sound to kinesthetic. So translating like sound, sight, what we just talked about, being able to hear from an image, to sound, sound, which is basically just emphasizing the sound, to kinesthetic. So imagine how something would physically feel based on the images in your brain about how it sounds, about how it smells, about how you're seeing it. He's just saying that the way that you cut up words in your poetry makes it so that you can introduce a new way of interpreting your words. And this is something that happens a lot in spoken word poetry, which is very popular right now. You mix and match words together. You cut up words so that they aren't full sentences, to just sort of pinpoint the image, the sight, the sound, the smell to that one line. And then you can use that as a jumping off point to play on like the emotions and the senses of the people who are listening or reading. So then summary down here we have, for the Beats, writing was not about breaking free of controlling influences. Was about breaking free of controlling influences, including the control of language itself. According to Burroughs, the word clearly bears the single identifying feature of virus. It is an organism with no internal function other than to replicate itself. So what he's saying here is that words exist to build on each other, to create more words, to create more description, to push more meaning. So it's important to think about words as that sort of unit. When you think of a sentence, even though we know how to speak English, there are ways to take things out, cut things, shift them around, and people will still understand what's being said. It's like those sort of puzzles or brain teasers where someone will spell words wrong or rearrange letters and words through the whole sentence, but you can still look at it and understand it because of how the brain works. He's basically talking about using words in a similar way by rearranging them in a sentence and by cutting things out and focusing on very specific things instead of everything being proper sentences all the time. Words exist to pile on each other to give you more information. And he's comparing it to a virus because words replicate themselves like that. Words add more and more so that you're saying more and more all the time. Okay, let's see. Let's see, did I forget something? Okay, no, okay. I jumped ahead by accident. All right, so this picture on the left is Bob Kaufman. He's gonna be the first person with the reading selection that we're addressing today. So this slide gives us information about him. And I'm just gonna hit some of the more important points that I have here. So we've got that he basically had a very varied cultural upbringing. And then they give you some examples. His father was a German or Orthodox Jew, and his mom was from Martinique. So that's very different cultures to have mixed and to be exposed to. He served in the Merchant Marines for 20 years, and he went to the New School for Social Research in NYC. He also he met Burroughs and Ginsberg in New York, and then he traveled with them to San Francisco, where he met Kerouac and Ferlinghetti. So this is how he got involved in the beat movement. So then talk about his poetry. His poetry reflects the influence of improv and the rhythm of bebop. So we talked about this before, how jazz influenced the beat movement, and Kaufman was the most affected by this of all of the beat poets. He did a lot of spontaneous poetry. So he would just sort of talk and compose his poems without writing them down. He never wrote down most of what he said. So he would just perform live improv, and you would never hear the same thing twice. His friends transcribed or wrote down and recorded a lot of his improvisations, and that includes this lessons reading. It's important to know that because he did a lot of improv and he was inspired by a lot of jazz, and he included that in his poetry, he earned the title the original bebop man. That's what he was called. And the name of the reading for today is Unanimity has been achieved, not a dot less for its accidentalness. That is the full name of the poem. They also talk about how he started the literary magazine Beatitude, which published a lot of beat poetry. And it was important because at the time, the City Lights publishing company that Ferlinghetti ran was the major publication up until this time. So Kaufman had a difficult time after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, and he took a vow of silence and didn't talk for 12 years. And when he did break his silence, it was with a dramatic poem about the withdrawal of US troops from Vietnam. So this is just commentary on how these events directly influenced the beat movement and what these poets did. And then a few years later, it says Kaufman retreated again into solitude, saying, "I want to be forgotten. My ambition is to be completely forgotten." Okay. Now, the next slide is giving you some tips on how to interpret the poetry that you're reading. So it says here, beat poetry can be difficult to understand because of its experimental forms and techniques, as well as the influence of jazz. So there's like a lot of scatter, a lot of repetition and stuff, and it's hard to it's very hard to understand these poems without taking time to actually stop and ask yourself, what does this mean? So it says, when reading a complicated poem, especially one with unfamiliar techniques or form, like this one, rewriting the lines as prosaic or straightforward, so just rewriting the lines as straightforward, will help you understand the poem's meaning and purpose. Consider this sample translation of a line below from Kaufman's Unanimity has been achieved, not a dot less for its accidentalness. So they give you the example here. The example here is raga of the drum, the drum, the drum, the drum, the drum, the heartbeat. And so we've got raga is a term that's related to music. So the way that this is interpreted, because we have the drum repeated so many times, and then the heartbeat. So if you were to translate this into sort of normal English, the prosaic line is that the heart beats like a drum playing music, because raga is a music term. We're talking about the beat of the beat of a heart, which is like a drum. This is an easier line to translate because we've seen in media and TV and movies the heart being referred to as a drum before. So this is an easier line to translate. But if you remember that raga is a musical term, and I think they address this during the analysis section, but I'm just giving it to you in advance in case you're one of those students that wants to read first before we get to the analysis. I personally think that it will help to have this section written down because having the example of how this was translated might help jumpstart your brain in terms of figuring out what the rest of the poems are saying. I have this personally in my notes as well, so I just think it's a good idea. Okay, as usual, I don't cover the excerpts. If you are having a hard time with this poem and you want help with translating it before you take a test or for your review, please schedule a tutoring session. It's okay if you don't understand the reading selections, but some of the reading selections take a lot of time to go through as opposed to sort of going through just the lesson and giving you a summary of the slides. So it's better to have your own tutoring session for the reading selection instead of me going through it line by line here. So make sure you do that. I'm going to go over the analysis in this video like I always do, because I'm hoping that sometimes the information you get in the analysis will help you when you go back to do the reading. I don't think that there's anything wrong with going ahead if you can. So what I would do is personally read the poem once, try to work through the lesson activity, and then I would go through this analysis and then go back and reread it just to make sure that you understand the poem so that you don't have any issues when you get to the mastery test. And that's just if you want to approach it on your own, if you want to try to figure it out on your own. If you don't think that you can get through the lesson the lesson activity. If you're having that hard a time with it, just schedule to go over the reading. Okay, here on slide 20, we talk about the analysis. It says here that Kaufman experimented with sound. And I mean, I feel like that's obvious, is just from the example that we had before. Raga, the drum, the drum, the drum, the drum, the drum. So we have a lot of repetition happening. And even just the word like raga, which is a musical term, like a musical word, the fact it's got 2 syllables, it's got the sound repeating, it definitely creates a rhythm along with the drum, the drum, the drum, the drum. When you're saying 1 syllable words over and over, you're creating a pattern. So they give you a little analysis of that here. It says the anaphora, which is a type of repetition. Basically, just to explain what type of repetition it is, anaphora is when you repeat a sequence of words at the beginning of each clause. So a clause is like a part of a sentence. So some sentences are long, some sentences are short. But when you repeat the same phrase in the beginning of a clause, similar to like if you're listing things, you repeat the same words at the beginning of things. This is something that happens in songs all the time. Different lines, which are part of a longer sentence of words in the lyrics, repeats the same thing over and over. That's called anaphora. And him using that in this poem is part of that experimentation. It says the word raga, which is a musical form, is emphatically repeated when introducing each idea or thought. And then they give you an example of this here, this quote. Raga of lip, raga of brass, raga of ultimate come with yesterday, raga of a parched tongue walked lip, raga of yellow, raga of mellow, raga of new, raga of old, raga of blue, raga of gold, raga of air spinning into itself. So the idea is he's giving you a list of things and he's linking them together by the idea of them being musical forms. He's giving you images and saying, this is the music of these things. But by repeating raga at the beginning of each of these lines, he's giving you emphasis on the concept of how music is important to how you imagine these things. If you take the raga out, and it says this here in the last paragraph here, he's giving you just a list. Brass, lip brass, ultimate come with yesterday, parched tongue, walked lip. We've got yellow, mellow, new, old, blue, gold. So some of these words rhyme, some of them don't. Some of them have the same number of syllables. These are almost just lyrics to a song that just is expressing the idea of music through the rhythm of the words that he's saying. Also, using raga as a descriptor to describe all these things makes it a little less obvious that he's got some rhyme and some musical stuff in here. It's one of those things that makes the line stick in your brain without you being able to understand why until you look at it a little harder. So by adding like raga of lip, raga of brass, it hides some of the rhythm and the rhyme. So your brain recognizes that it's there when you read it out loud or when you hear someone else read it out loud, but it's not something that consciously comes up because it's not super obvious. The definition of raga adds meaning to each idea, making each one a musical form in and of itself. So literally translated, this line is the musical form of yellow, which is an abstract musical concept. And he does this for everything that's here. So we've got music of the lip, music of brass. Like that's the translation. It's music of all of these things that he's thrown together. Okay, now outside of the form, we're going to get into what the subject of the poem is. Kaufman addresses social inequality in this poem. And there's a couple issues, but he talks about poverty most of all. And they give you a quote here. A beggar is the body of a goddess, come to shoot movies with his eye, movies of people who do not beg. Ragged broke eagles hummed into the wheels turning, some in, others out, rarely ever in or out, or vice versa have open. And basically he's describing the differences between people who have things and people who don't. Because watching people who are enjoying their lives, it says here, movies of people who do not beg. So he's comparing what you see when you watch other people to watching a movie, because you're on the outside looking at people the same way that you do when you are watching a movie. Okay, now there's not actually a slide title for this one. I think that they left it out by accident, but this section is where they get into Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and we get to know a little more about him, about his writing, I should say. So we already heard about how he, published works by Ginsberg that were considered offensive. He had to deal with the being sued about it, and he won. But they give you more background here about his personal life. He was born an orphan and taken in by his aunt. And he graduated with a degree in journalism. He joined the Navy during World War II, and he visited Nagasaki, and became a pacifist after seeing the devastation of the atomic bomb there. He was the co-founder of the City Lights bookstore in California. That's what we were learning about earlier when he published things. He became central to the rise of the movement by publishing beat poetry works. And it says here he successfully defended himself legally from the charges about the offensive nature of the stuff he published. And even though he didn't like being labeled as important to the beat movement, he definitely has been considered as one of the most influential poets. Now, one of his most notable works is To the Oracle at Delphi, and that's what we're going to be reading today. So again, if you're having difficulty with the lesson, with the reading selection to answer the lesson activity questions, feel free to schedule a tutoring session with a tutor and we can help you. But I'm not going to go over the reading selection. You can pause here and come back when you're done reading and we can get into the analysis. If you're one of those students that wants to hear the analysis before you go into the lesson and do the reading, then that works too. Now here, when they get started, they're just explaining the references that are being made. The Oracle at Delphi is something that's important to Greek mythology. Basically, Sybil is the name of the oracle, and the oracle is known for being able to see into the future. So I give you some information about why that concept is important by giving you the intro here. It says, great oracle sleeping through the centuries, awaken now at last and tell us how to save us from ourselves. So that gives you the subject of the poem. He's basically calling on the Oracle of Delphi to ask for insight into the future, and to try to give us guidance on how to proceed with a country that's as divided on as many things as this. But so he starts off basically appealing to the oracle as a great power. And what you find out as you read a little further is that the oracle only was able to give people vague or like riddle responses to the future. And he doesn't reveal this until after he gets through the intro. So the intro is very hopeful at first, and then it starts to go into details about how people will have to do things for themselves, because the oracle can't be relied upon. And there's something to be said about doing this in reverse order. Obviously, Ferlinghetti knows that the oracle can only give people vague, sort of murky, is what the word they use here, glimpses into the future. But he's calling out to the oracle anyway to sort of express the idea that, one, he thinks that things can be saved, and two, that he wishes a greater power would in fact save things instead of just saying that they're doomed. So he's trying to communicate hope in the beginning here by addressing what he's wishing for before he addresses how realistic that wish actually is. Now, basically, he asks the oracle, they go into detail here about what he's asking for, the oracle to help save us, that's the country, from social inequalities and poverty that's caused by corporate culture. And they go into a little detail about this here. He calls it corporate monoculture in the poem. So they give you some background on that. He plays on the phrase corporate culture, that's like the culture of corporations, right? And he adds mono to it. So mono just means one single thing. So he's trying to suggest that the type of conformity, or I'm sorry, the type of culture just wants everyone to assimilate, come together, and just become this faceless thing. So like, screw who you are as an individual, just come and follow our rules, and you'll be fine. He disagrees with the idea of that. And instead of referring to it as a culture, calling it a monoculture is kind of a diss, because he's saying there's no personality, there's no like oomph, there's no spirit in it, there's no soul in it. And then he says he also addresses the great divide between the upper and lower classes. Absolutely. He says in the great, who would make a plutocracy of our democracy in the great divide between the rich and poor? So he's addressing the fact that there's a gap here. And this is important at the time because some people didn't believe in the gap, or they were caught up being content with being middle class and everything. So they didn't want to acknowledge that there was a difference. And in this poem, when you get to it while you're reading, he makes a reference to the Walt Whitman poem, I Hear America Singing, right after this. So just as a quick reminder, I Hear America Singing is a very hopeful, optimistic poem about people in America who are working in all different sort of classes and different jobs coming together. It describes a song that's being sung by every citizen who is working and contributing to society on the planet, basically. And pretty much he's referencing this to sort of remind people that this was once the American dream, right? Like the idea of everyone working together and respecting one another and things like that. So he's hoping that the United States can be like that again. And I think that's it for the reading selections. Okay, so the focus on language here is the last thing. As per usual, if you are not familiar with these words or you're not sure about them, take time to write these down. At least write down the word and part of speech in the definition. But if you need help with pronunciation, or with these other parts of speech to just be reminded of how else it can be used, feel free to use that as well. And I think that's actually it for this lesson. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll go over this last slide really quick. Basically, they just want to make it clear that you understand that the Beat Generation was a product of everything that was happening in the postmodern era. And generally, they had a lot of stuff happening outside of just the writing that they were doing, but they were rejecting old classical traditional stuff and social conventions at the same time. They didn't want to be acceptable people. They wanted to be people who supported the right thing for themselves and for this country. They didn't mind being influenced by cultures that were outside of their own with bebop jazz. And they were defined a lot more by what they were saying than the style of what they were saying, because the things they talked about turned heads and caught people's attention, partially because it was offensive. That's basically what defines them a little more than their actual styles. I think that's about it. Okay, so we've gone over a lot for this lesson. So as always, if you're having issues with the class or the readings, please schedule a tutoring appointment so that we can go over this with you and try to get a little more information about what you need and what it is that you're not understanding. But other than that, just just refer to this video, go back and rewind, do whatever it is you need to do to make sure that you're understanding things. From this point forward, we're just going to get into more and more history behind the literary movements that we're studying. So make sure that you're just taking your time to go through and understand the background before you read the selections, because you can see the influence of the background within the selections. But that's it for me. That's pretty much it. So reach out. You can send us an email at the english@atsedu.net. Email if you're having any, if you have any quick questions that you just want answered really fast. But other than that, contact your mentor, your advocate, or reach out to me or Kathy Vahovic. And that's it. This is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with the rest of your English class.